Well, like we usually do, why don't we begin with just a few minutes of meditation on the breath to settle the mind, and calm extraneous discursive thoughts. Just give a couple minutes of silence, a few minutes of silence for that. So we can continue in a meditative kind of mode for a few more minutes, but now we shift our focus from breath to cultivating uh, equanimity, great love, great compassion, and bodhicitta. And so we'll just take a few minutes to cultivate bodhicitta as our motivation for the class and also for this day. So then with that bodhicitta motivation, we can do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Good to see folks. Let's see. Well, in our text, we're up to page 80. You're up to non-introspection. So let's jump in there. So yeah, so this is the page 80, and we're on the 19 out of the 20 secondary mental afflictions. And so this one, our translator calls it non-introspection. Art Engel translated this one as lack of vigilance. Or I think somebody else translated it as inattentiveness. So you can choose which, Again, I just find those different phrasings can help. Because part of the reason why is like actually interesting, inattentiveness, lack of vigilance, or non-introspection. You'll see that I don't know, the word introspection in English, I think, has a certain connotation that is more specific than this one's getting at. So, but I mean, it's a reasonable translation, I think, but you can see like what we usually mean by "are you introspective" is something more specific. This is a broader description. So regarding non-introspection, the Compendium of Knowledge says, what is non-introspection? Then the response. It is a wisdom that is concomitant with the afflictions and engages unknowingly in activities of body, speech, and mind. It has the function of acting as a support for infractions. So I think a key point here is engages unknowingly in actions of body, speech, and mind. So you call it like a lack of awareness of one's own body, speech, and mind. So you're not really being aware of what's going on. Actually, so that he said. I mean, this translator says engages unknowingly, right, in activities of body, speech, and mind. I'll just compare it in our English translation from Vasubandhu. It says one is inattentive to one's own three doors, one's body, speech, and mind. So there's an inattentive, so it's interesting, unknowing or inattentive. So in other words, you're doing things, or your mind is doing things, and actually it happens all the time, doesn't it? You can look back suddenly, you can have a certain, on the one hand, just with your mind, right? That happens often, doesn't it? Where you go, oh my goodness, for the last 15 minutes I've been thinking about this, I didn't even realize it. That would be this lack of vigilance or non-introspection, right? Where you're not aware. But it could also be with your speech, right? Have you ever, I'm sure we've all probably done that, right? Where you go, what in the world did I just say to that person? Right. So you were speaking, right? But with a lack of attentiveness or awareness to what you were saying, right? And after, sometimes then we can be embarrassed or regret what we said or something like that, right? And the same with body, right? Like you can go like, oh my goodness, what was, like you're sort of doing something and you're not really being aware. Actually it could be, and this could be, on a moral issue where you're sort of just acting out impulsively and not being aware, or it could even just be like not being aware, where you, where you kind of stumble or something. Actually, I just remember I'm just saying it. I'll just say it since a joke. It was funny actually, but the other day actually somebody from the American Psychological, I did non-introspection. Somebody from the American Psychological Association wrote to me because I had done a training video on mindful psychotherapy for them many years ago. And they said they were updating their website and they needed an updated bio and a new picture of me. So I sent the bio and then I sent a bunch of pictures. And then the guy wrote back and said, thank you. And I looked at the pictures I'd sent and I realized I'd sent a few pictures, like pictures of my face, but I had included accidentally a picture of some Tibetan books and a picture of Shayla at a retreat that we had gone to. And so I looked and I started laughing hysterically because I'm like, it was mindful therapy, right? So I had done a training video on mindful therapy and I had not been mindful while sending my pictures. So Anyway, I sent like additional pictures that I wrote to the guy and said, oh, that was kind of funny. So that was non-introspection. It's not, not being aware of my action of body in that case, right? I wasn't noticing as I was clicking images very carefully. Um, First, I wanted to blame my iPhone, but I thought, no, it's my lack of mindfulness. You can't blame the iPhone. So that's not introspection of body, right? So we can have it. You get my point. It could be a body of speech or of mind, and I can certainly think of many examples of each of the three, where I was not, where you're not aware of what you're thinking and feeling, and oftentimes that also happens with, like emotions, doesn't it? Where somebody will say, oh, you seem really this, and you go, oh, I wasn't even, like at first you might think, no, I'm not, and then if you kind of stop and think, you go, oh, wow, I am, or you realize, oh, I've been feeling this way for a few days, but I didn't notice it for a few hours or something, right? So all of those would be non-introspection. So it could be of your body, your speech, and your mind. And then in Art Engel's translation, he says, this supports committing moral and ethical transgressions because it fails to determine what one ought do or ought not do. And it says, just as has been said above, it is an afflicted wisdom that engages unknowingly in activities of the three doors. It is discordant with the class of introspection. This non-introspection acts as a support for infractions. That this non-introspection acts as a support for infractions accords with what it says in engaging the Bodhisattva's deeds. So Shantideva, even though learned, faithful, and diligent in effort, many become tainted by downfalls due to the fault of lacking introspection. So what's being gotten at here, right, by Kachin Yeshi Gelsen and by Shantideva, is that the particular issue around non-introspection actually isn't sending the wrong picture. That's not a big deal. The issue is that when we're not introspective, then that leads to because we're not noticing what we're doing, it can easily lead us to being non-virtuous, right? To doing harmful things, right? And so, if we're not aware of what we're doing with our body, speech, and mind, it becomes very easy, for example, to have mental afflictions and they just go on and we don't address them, right? And then if we have our mental afflictions going on in our mind and we're not addressing them, then we say something harsh, right? Or we say a lie, or we say something that hurts somebody, right? And so on, or you do something like that. And so that's the key, I think. That's the key point here, is that this kind of inattentiveness or lack of vigilance or lack of introspection leads to moral failings, you could say, right? So moral mistakes, ethical mistakes. And ethical mistakes include what we do with our mind, if that makes sense in this sense, right? Because the actions of our mind are karma also. So and the simple example of that is like if you're sitting there, for example, if you're sitting around being angry at somebody, right, and thinking hateful thoughts, and it's just going on and on, you're not sort of noticing, hey, wait a second, this is a mental affliction. I'm in a state of anger and hatred. I need to address that. That would be an example, right, of non-introspection. Geshe Rabten on this topic says, actually, I like this point better. He says, it is being an afflicted state of intelligence. I personally prefer intelligence to wisdom. I mean, the word, better words can be translated different ways, but our text translate a wisdom that is kankman. It's not really a wisdom, is it? I mean, at least in the English sense, that's not being wise, obviously. It's an I think an intelligence is maybe a more interesting way to describe it. So Geshe Rabten's translator says, it is an afflicted state of intelligence which has made either no or very rough analysis and is not aware of the conduct of one's own body, speech, or mind, and thus causes one to enter into a state of careless indifference. And so you're indifferent to what you're doing. And therefore, and then as Shantideva said, going back to Shantideva's quote here, he's making a point that even if you're, so even if you're learned, so even if you study the Dharma, for example, if you're not watching your own mind, then that doesn't help you much, does it? So in other words, so if you understand all the methods for generating bodhicitta, but then you're not actually working with your own mind moment to moment, it doesn't really help, right? Or if you understand all kinds of philosophical points of Buddhism, but if you're not aware of your own in the moment actions of body, speech, and mind, you're not working with yourself, right? And then faithful and diligent effort. That point there is like, it's actually true, isn't it? Like, so for example, a person could go off and do like a retreat, right? Or go and do some kind of project to work for others. But if you're not aware of your own body, speech, and mind, then say right. Then even if you're actually, then even if you're in retreat, it's not really a retreat, is it? Because the real meaning of retreat is to retreat from the mental afflictions. So if you're not aware of your own mind, then you could be like sitting in a hermitage somewhere, in front of an altar or something. But if your mind is on mental afflictions and you're not introspecting or vigilant or attentive to that, then you're just, it's called a retreat maybe, but it's not actually a retreat in that sense. So so it's, in that sense, your practice becomes tainted, as Shantideva says. So that kind of covers, I think, that. Yeah. Well, and then there's just one more. It was up to the last of these secondary mental afflictions. Maybe I'll cover that, and then we'll pause and kind of do questions about the secondary mental afflictions, as we'll end this section. So the last of the 20 secondary mental afflictions is distraction. And the text says, again, quoting the Abhidharma, the meaning of knowledge, what is distraction? Response: it is a scattering of the mind and is involved with attachment, hatred, and ignorance. It has the function of hindering separation from attachment. So, and I guess that actually distraction, I think that's kind of pretty close to what we mean usually in English by distraction. Actually, well, our text will explain this, but I'll wait till it gets there. So in brief, though, so if you have an object that you're trying to concentrate on or keep your mind on, and then, as it says here, out of attachment, hatred, ignorance. So in brief, out of any mental affliction, if your mind then scatters to other things, that's distraction, right? So you're trying to focus on something, and then you have some kind of mental affliction, your mind jumps away to other topics, then that's distraction. Geshe Rabten, on this point, his description, he says, unable to direct the mind towards a wholesome object, it disperses to a variety of other objects. Concentration deteriorates, and it acts as a basis for losing attention in either fixed or analytical meditation. So it could also be in the context, so you could be like trying to read a book, study a text, like a Dharma text, and your mind jumps away. But it could be that you're trying to meditate, or it could be trying to, but in anything where you're trying to focus, your mind gets distracted and jumps away out of a mental affliction. So it says, just as has been said above, it causes the mind to be distracted from its object of observation through the force of afflictions. A discussion of the five aggregates explained it as a scattered mind to the five attributes of the desire realm. So that would be where, your mind is going towards objects of the desire realm. And then it says qualm. This is what I was about to raise a minute ago. So it says, is there no difference between this distraction and the excitement that was explained above? Response: excitement is a scattering to attractive objects previously familiarized with and is involved with attachment, whereas distraction can be distracted to any object and be involved with all three poisons, thus they are different. So you get so actually, I personally think that excitement would be one form of distraction. That's one way to describe it. And so, sometimes, and actually it's interesting in the text, when you read like texts on, you read teachings, study teachings on developing calm abiding, right? Usually the two main obstacles are excitement and sinking, mental excitation or excitement and mental sinking. Sometimes distraction is added as a third main obstacle. So what's the difference, right? One reason they emphasize excitement is that it's the one, as you progress in your concentration meditation, excitement will be the main obstacle. But early on, distraction actually is very present, and so and the difference, right? So excitement is, as it says here, is defined as, and or is what it is the mind scatters out to some object of attachment, right? Some attractive object that you've been attached to in the past, and your mind jumps there. And if you practice meditation, right, this happens often. Whereas distraction, that would be one type of distraction, but actually, especially when we're starting to practice or something like that, or or anything like that, anytime. So distraction is more varied, right? Like, so if you start to, like let's say you're sitting and an example of excitement would be, right? So you're sitting trying to, let's say, meditate, and your mind jumps to certain food or a certain friend or a certain whatever, something like that, or a TV show you want to watch on Netflix or whatever. If your mind jumps to that, that's excitement, right? It's an object, if it's an object of your attachment. Distraction could be that, right? But it also includes other things. So like if a person were sitting trying to meditate and suddenly they started thinking, oh, what's wrong with me? Why did I do that yesterday, right? And they start feeling discouraged about themselves. Well, that's not excitement. It's not an object of attachment, but it is a distraction, right? It's a distraction connected to self-image. Right? It would be pride or negative, a negative sense of pride, right? Putting yourself down. Or if you're trying to meditate and then you start thinking about somebody who annoyed you the other day, right? That would be distraction connected to anger, right? But it's not excitement, right? You're not excited in the sense of it's not an object of attachment that you're like wanting. It's that your mind is jumping away because of, connected to a mental affliction of anger. So there are many other, right? There are many different, or jealousy, right? If you start thinking, oh, I don't have what this other person has, and that's terrible, and I should have a nicer thing like them. Any of those would be distractions that are not excitement. Right? And so part of what they're getting at just is that both of those are obstacles, right? And problematic. Especially if you're trying to develop concentration. And so we have to be aware, or we have to be introspective, going back to the previous one, right? And catch them when they arise and address them with antidotes. And so they both arise as obstacles to meditation. And then our author does something interesting. It says, when distraction is divided, there are 6. So he lists 6 different types of distractions. And actually, yes, we'll go through them just briefly. They're kind of just because, he shares them. So he says, first one, and actually one thing that's interesting though, and he says this later, so I'll just mention it now, is these 6 are examples where the mind gets distracted. But then he makes a point. He says they're not necessarily secondary. They're not all of these are not the secondary mental affliction of distraction. Some of them are, and some are examples of the mind getting distracted that are not a mental affliction. So it's kind of interesting that he includes in his description of this mental affliction types of distraction that are not mental affliction. So you have to recognize the difference, I suppose. But they would still be obstacles to concentration, if that makes sense. And actually, I'll just make a very simple example, right? Let's say you're trying to, I'm just going to go off on a tangent here. There are distractions that aren't mental afflictions, right? Because let's say you're trying to meditate on an image of the Buddha. It's a typical one taught in the Lamrim, right? Where you meditate on an image of the Buddha. So let's say you're trying to meditate on an image of the Buddha, and then your mind gets distracted because you're thinking of loving kindness towards somebody who is sick, right? Like a friend of yours who's sick. Your mind is distracted, but that's not a mental affliction, is it? Like, in other words, you're having love for somebody who you care about, right? So that would be an example where it's just interesting, isn't it? So what we, in English, we would say distract, that's a distraction, right? You're distracted from your object of concentration, but it's definitely not a mental affliction, right? And so that's a point that, kind of as you go through these, you'll see there are some examples of distractions that are mental afflictions, but there are examples where the mind gets distracted from its object of meditation. Excuse me, but it's not a mental affliction. And part of the point there, I'll just mention, is that So in other words, in ordinary life, if your mind goes to a virtuous state of mind, that's fine, isn't it? And that's not a problem, right? If you're trying, if you're, um, if you were reading a book about, say, the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, and then you paused and your mind got jumped away to, being concerned for somebody who's suffering, that's not a bad thing. Let's say it was compassion. But if you're trying to concentrate, if you're trying to develop calm abiding, then it is a problem. Because it's not conducive to calm abiding. With calm abiding, they actually say when you choose an object of concentration, even other virtuous states of mind need to be, you need to avoid them during that time and keep with your chosen object of concentration. Otherwise, you won't develop calm abiding. It's the problem. So that's part of what's being done out there. Something I just wanted to mention that because that applies for us even in meditation, right? That if actually just the other day, I was trying to do actually a sadhana, right? So and then my mind jumped away to something positive, like I wanted to sort of help somebody with something, but that's not positive in the context of trying to practice my sadhana, right? Whereas I need to do that later. Think about that some other time. So that's a distraction, and it needs to be abandoned, even though it's not non-virtue in that case. So I'm just giving an example. But okay, so his list of 6. So the first one is distraction by way of entity, or another translator said inherent distraction. But anyway, distraction by way of its very entity is explained to be the 5 sense consciousnesses. So this one's not necessarily non-virtuous, right? So says the reason is that at the time of being set in equipoise on meditative concentration, if any of the 5 sense consciousnesses are generated, then the mind arises from the meditative concentration. Thus, they are called outward distraction away from the mind of meditative concentration. So what is this one, right? This is we've all experienced this. If you're sitting, this one is specifically, if you're sitting trying to practice single-pointed concentration, and then say there's a loud noise, right? And your ear consciousness inevitably engages that loud noise. Because we're in the desire realm, right? It's the nature of desire realm beings or something, that when the mind goes to that sense consciousness, you lose your concentration on the object, right? Again, in my example, if you're focusing on an image of the Buddha in front of you, and then you hear a loud sound outside, your mind loses the object, right? Or if you're sitting, and meditating, and then you see something go by, your mind, your eye consciousness, but also your awareness then goes to the visual sense, and so on, or we've all had that experience, right? Physical, right? If suddenly you develop a pain, then in your knee or something, you may lose your object of concentration. So the point here is that this kind of distraction is where the mind jumps to the sense consciousnesses, and he makes that point here, though. He says, that is sense consciousness. Yeah. So anyway, so there are distractions from meditative concentration, right, by the mind going, and so that's why also when you're trying to cultivate calm abiding, they say go someplace quiet, right, without many distractions. So that there are descriptions of the kind of place, because if we're beginners, it's very difficult to develop meditative concentration if there are a lot of sense consciousness, sensory experiences around us, right? So they suggest, for example, a quiet place, someplace without a lot of distraction and so on. They say once somebody's developed very good concentration, then they can be somewhere busy. It won't matter, but until then, you need a conducive environment. Then external distraction is the second one. External distraction is when one is engaged in virtues of the 3, listening, contemplating, or meditating. The outward scattering of the mind to the attributes of the desire realm without abiding in virtues anymore. Since it causes scattering to an erroneous object of observation without abiding on the virtuous object of observation, it is called such. I guess Rabton describes when he says, it is a characteristic of desire realm minds. Within the desire realm, wholesome states of mind are consistently subject to being dispersed from one object to another. And so this one, it could be, this one, from from the way it's described, right? So one point is it's not just concentrating, it's not just meditating. It could be meditating, or it could be listening, like studying Dharma, or it could be thinking about Dharma. Right? So you could be doing any of those things, and then your mind jumps away from that to some outward thing in the desire realm. So here it doesn't necessarily have to be a sensory thing, right? You could just give, whereas if your mind suddenly, and I gave that example earlier, right? If you were, if you, let's say you were contemplating or studying Dharma, and then your mind jumps to food, right? Or jumps to, like a Netflix show or something, right? It's not necessarily, in the first example, it would have to be that you smelled the food, right? If you're in a retreat and somebody's cooking, then you smell the food, then your mind, your nose, right? That's your nose consciousness, was a source of distraction. But in this example, it could be your mind, right? So your mind could suddenly think of your favorite food and think, oh, I want that. Then that'll be an example. Or you think, oh, wow, I can't wait till later I can watch streaming, whatever, something. That would be an example of this kind of distraction, right? Because those are objects of the desire realm. Yeah. Then the next one is internal distraction. So internal distraction is laxity, excitement, and craving for the taste of meditative absorption at the time of being set in equipoise on meditative concentration. What is the reason for calling these internal distraction? They are so called because they are the main obstacles for cultivating meditative concentration internally. So these are inner states that distract the mind away from either actual calm abiding. So it's here you're trying to cultivate shamatha, right? So calm abiding, or vipassana, which is special insight. But vipassana includes shamatha. I mean, there's a special insight means you have that you're either already have those, or you're developing some what's the word? A state similar to those. So you're sort of developing your own. If you haven't yet developed calm abiding, but you're sort of progressing, and you're cultivating your best approximation of that. Then in this one, what happens is that the mind either becomes well, here the examples would be, so one example is laxity, right? So in other words, here the distraction is that the mind becomes too what's the word, like too loose, right? And there's no longer clarity, or there's some level of excitement, right? And we said earlier there are two levels of excitement. There's gross excitement, where the mind actually loses its object and jumps away, but there's also a kind of subtler excitement where the mind keeps its object, but there's an underlying excitement at the same time. And so the point here is those are internal distractions, right? There, especially if it's the subtle excitement, right? Your mind hasn't jumped away to an object of desire realm. It's still on its object of concentration, but it's not going to absorb in that. It's not going to stay very deeply concentrated on that because of excitation. Or with laxity, there's a lack of clarity, right? And a lack of intensity to your focus. So it's not good concentration. So in those examples, right, that'd be internal distraction, in the sense that you're not, it's an obstacle to developing deeper states of concentration. And we have to overcome our laxity or excitement in order to progress through the 9 levels of moving towards calm abiding, so on. Then the next one, distraction by way of signs, is to put effort into virtuous training with the thought, how wonderful it would be if another person would develop conviction in me, thinking he or she has attained concentration. So in this one, it's a particular kind of, I think it's included because first of all, it's a mental affliction, but secondly, because it seems to be somewhat common, is that, this is where you're doing an example of like doing a retreat or something, right? And then you think, oh, how, people will think I'm so great because I did this, right? Isn't that amazing, right? And so then that's distraction, right? That's a problem, so that's that particular type of distraction, and I think it's included because that happens sometimes, right? That can fall into that. Then distraction by way of unfavorable states is a puffing up of the mind, conceiving I and mine, when feeling one is engaging in virtue and depends upon the unfavorable states of the view of the transitory collection. Geshe Rabten gave an interesting phrase, I think, where he said, this is he called this one rigid distraction of self-importance. So this is similar to the one above, but this is broader, right? So it could be any type of pride and any type of engagement in the view of the transitory collection. So, it's where you're caught up, so you're again, you're trying to actually, I think this one, actually, I want to say broader comment, right? In the previous one, you're thinking like, oh, people will think I'm so great because I'm doing spiritual practice. This one is broader, it's the view of the transitory collection and pride, but remember all the different types of pride, right? So this could be any of those, right? So if you were thinking, so it could be like, it doesn't necessarily mean people will think what people will think of you, right? But if you're comparing yourself, if you're thinking, wow, I'm almost as good as that other person who did retreat, right? Or practice, or if you were thinking the low self-esteem version, right? Because it's still self-importance, right? Oh, I'm not so good. What's wrong with me? And I'm like, I'm not as good as everybody else, right? So it's an over self-referential state, that rather than engaging, when you're trying to engage in something virtuous, rather than simply engaging in the virtue, you start sort of getting caught up in overly self-referential thinking that arises from the view of the transitory collection, right? Which means, so the transitory collection, remember, right? Those are the collection are the 5 aggregates, right, that are transitory and changing every instant. But we view an I and a mine based on those, and then you start referring too much or over-referential to that with self-importance or with pride. That's this one. And the last of these is distraction by way of mental engagement. And so he gives 2 examples. One is giving up meditative absorption of the 4th concentration for the meditative absorption of the 3rd concentration or below. So that's where you're in a higher state of concentration and you go and you sort of abandon it to go to a less concentrated state. Or the next example he gives is giving up engaging in the great vehicle, the Mahayana, I shall abide in the lesser vehicle, right? So it's in this example, it's actually interesting. This is like this in this case, right? What they're saying is distraction in this instance is you're in a particularly sublime state of virtue, and you let your mind get distracted to a lesser virtue. That's interesting, isn't it? So this one is actually not a mental affliction. It's still virtuous. It's just a lesser virtue. Does that make sense? And what they're saying is actually that wouldn't be a mental affliction. So that's another example of these that would definitely not be a mental affliction. But it's a distraction in the sense that it's hindering your progress on the path, isn't it? If you let your mind go from a higher, more sublime virtue to a less sublime virtuous state, there's a kind of distraction that slows your progress on the path. Or in the case of giving up the great vehicle for the lesser vehicle, it's actually, you'll achieve a lesser goal, in that case. So like that. So that's where then he explains below. These types of distraction are taught to be general enumerations of distraction, but it is not definite that they are actual secondary afflictions, right? I just gave it that example, right? Your mind went from a higher virtue to a lower virtue. That's not an actual secondary mental affliction, but it is a distraction. And he says, so the first is unspecified, right? The one if your mind is going to sensory objects, and the last one is included within virtue, it's mentioned. Since it is taught that the distraction that is a secondary affliction is, for instance, the external distraction and the internal distraction, which have been explained here, those of keen intellect need to analyze this in detail. So what he's saying is, what? You can check for yourself, like analyze, can you come up with examples? Actually, it'd be interesting to do, right? The mental exercises. Can you, actually, not just a mental exercise, but check your own experience, right? Can you think of examples where you engage in distraction that was a mental affliction? That's easy, actually, right? If you're trying to concentrate and you think of something you're upset about, or you think of, something you're just, or you think of negative self-esteem or something, right? Those would be, but can you think of examples of distractions that were not mental afflictions, but were still distractions, right? In your own experience. And again, it's just, what's the usefulness of this, right? Just want to remind us, it's self-awareness, right? It's to go, okay, wow, I get it now. Sometimes I get distracted and it's mental affliction. That's completely useless. But sometimes I'm letting myself get distracted. Like that example of, the example of the last one of that list, mental engagement, right, where you're going from the 4th meditative abiding to the 3rd. you know, unfortunately, I don't have a risk of that since I can't achieve the fourth concentration. I don't have a risk of, I don't have to worry about falling into the third. But there are many examples actually, right, where your mind is on something good, right, particularly wonderful, and then I mean, I can think of many examples where I get distracted to something that's still maybe a kindness or a good thing, but it's not as meaningful, right? And actually, I mean, I think that's useful to reflect on, because, like, to say it right, like, there's that phrase that sometimes people use, not in Buddhism, but there's a phrase like, there are different ways people put it, the tyranny of the urgent or something, right? Like the difference between what's urgent and what's important. People talk about that, right? That something can seem very urgent in the moment, but actually, we're going to die, and if we let our mind not stay on what was really important, even if what's urgent is morally neutral, right? Like that I didn't pay my bill, and that's like not a moral issue. Yeah, I'm late, like I forgot, the bill's due tomorrow. That seems urgent, right? The mind could get distracted from practicing Dharma because, oh no, I've got to go and do my online bill pay or something. I forgot to pay my whatever. So then your mind, actually, that would be an example of distraction, right? That's the mind is going from, maybe in that case, might be from a virtuous state. Let's say if you're meditating on bodhicitta and then you think, oh, wait a second, I forgot to pay my bill. That would be distraction. But it's a huge loss, actually, right? As you went from focusing on bodhicitta, which is the cause of enlightenment, to during your meditation session worrying about paying a bill, which you need to pay, but not during a meditation session. And then compare that, right? If you're meditating on bodhicitta and then your mind gets distracted by thinking of how you're annoyed at somebody, then the mind's going from virtue to non-virtue. But then let's say, then there's another example. This last one I was getting at, where you go from a higher to lower virtue. If you're meditating on bodhicitta and then you think, there was one the other day where I thought, oh yeah, there was one I thought, like, I have somebody I know is sick. I thought, oh, I want to email them. So you're meditating on, I was doing a practice, right? And then you think, oh, I forgot to email my friend who's sick, my person who's sick, who I wanted to, now that's kind, right? It's actually a kind thing. It's a sense of love there, but it's a lesser virtue, actually, right? So it's good to follow up with the person who's sick, but again, not during your practice, right? That's not the thing to focus on during your Dharma practice. So that would be an example of just a mundane example, right, where our mind can get distracted, and that's not to a non-virtue, but it's still a distraction. So I'm just giving real examples of that. Since the fourth, like I said, going from the fourth to the third meditative concentration isn't our main concern, but these other ones, there are real examples of all of those. And so it's good to notice those, because then we can, what's the word, get better at them, right? And actually, I just want to make a general point before we go on, like, because we'll say more about this, but I just want to give, like, all of these things, like the non-introspection and these distraction, and these are tools, right? Tools for self-awareness. And the point is to use them to be more aware of ourselves in order to become better at our practice, right? And anyway, so yeah, you get the point. So, like, if we can notice these examples, then we can become better at working with them. Whereas if we're not aware we're doing them, or if we're sort of careless or whatever, then we can't work with them, and then we don't get better. And our practice won't progress. Well, I'll just do this last paragraph and then I'll pause for questions, because this paragraph ends the section on the secondary mental affliction. So it just says, in this way, these 20 from belligerence up to distraction, so those are the 20, right, are called secondary afflictions, or literally near afflictions, because they are near to or involved with the root afflictions, right? They're like further elaborations of the root afflictions in a way. Furthermore, you should understand them individually, belligerence and resentment being near to anger, and being involved with anger and so forth. Most of them are clear from the Abhidharma passages that have been previously cited. So, there he's just saying, right, that you can understand how these are, like, elaborations on the principal, the six primary mental afflictions, main mental afflictions, and these are further expressions of those. And if we become aware of them, then we can work with them more effectively, right? So that's why they're elaborated. Any questions about those before we go on to the next section, or comments or whatever? Go, Frank. Yeah.
Yeah, so the discussion on distraction and calm abiding made me think that my personal example, sometimes I might be trying to do calm abiding, maybe on money or some object. And I think I'm concentrating pretty well. And then there'll be a sound or something, it'll startle me. I'm like, wow. And then I'm thinking, well, that's not very good, actually, if I'm going to be startled like that. So that ultimately, I guess my question is, are we looking for calm abiding on an object, but at the same time, there's a sort of a general awareness of everything else going on, such that we would not be startled when these other sounds or things happen?
No, actually, I think what you're doing is better, actually. Like, in other words, because if you're really trying to focus, like, because the idea really is that we ideally, like, actually, when they talk about developing calm abiding, what they actually say is that what we want is for the mind to become more and more absorbed within its object of concentration, and eventually, actually, where you're not even aware of, like, the sensory, the senses. You kind of lose. So actually, in one way, if you're being startled like that, that's a good sign. That means that, like, you really are kind of, like, what's the word? They sometimes say, like, you're bringing the mind inward, is the way in this text there are phrases like that, right? That your mind is kind of coming inward. What they mean is that that the sense, actually, one way of saying it is that we actually, in that sense, we want our senses to become like, our sense experiences to become, there's that phrase, objects that are either not apprehended, or they're apprehended but not, that are like, where it's heard but not apprehended, where you're so not focused on them that you don't even notice them, because you're really absorbed within the mani or the image of the deity or whatever it might be. So actually, that's a sign of progress, really, and that's why, though, then our environments aren't perfect, but it's why they say, like, quiet. Actually, Kent Rinpoche, when he was teaching on developing calm abiding, he had this phrase that he quoted, which was that he said, for somebody who's progressing in meditation, he said, sound is like a thorn of the mind. That sound, particularly, because we can close our eyes, and we can sort of put ourselves somewhere where nothing's touching us. But sound is harder. And so you're saying sound becomes, as you make progress, sound becomes like the thorn of the mind that sort of will disturb your meditative concentration. But that's actually, I think that's a sign of progress, actually, because that's what we're trying to do, actually, is not, is not be aware of all of our. It's actually interesting. There are some forms of meditation where you are trying to be aware of your senses, of course. But when you're focusing to develop calm abiding, you're actually trying not to. So I think actually that's a good sign. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then Sujata has.
Is the two-part question. The first is around, is the antidote to this distraction just to keep trying, like just to keep practicing single point of concentration? There's nothing else to do on distraction except to keep trying to not be distracted. And then, obviously, on the more gross things, like find a suitable place for meditation, or like reduce the number of animals you're around, etc. But yes, is the antidote on distraction simply keep practicing? Is my first question.
I think actually it'd be my own understanding of that, I guess, is on the one hand, yes. Obviously that's true. So one is the environmental factors. The second is keep practicing. But then also there's the actually, it's interesting, like, if you like, actually, like, I was thinking when you asked that, it made me think of in Panchen Lama Losing Choki Gelsen's Mahamudra text. He makes a kind of, he gives these interesting points related to what you're saying, where he kind of says, and he's giving an example of meditating on the nature of mind, but the same point would apply to other things, other kinds of meditation. But so, like, let me say it the right way. I think with distraction, what he's getting at, he makes different points, but I think what he's getting is that there are many different, like, ways of working with distraction. So I would say it. And so one is like, if you can see the distraction as it's beginning to arise, like if you're actually meditating, right, on something, and then if you're aware enough that you can see your mind just starting to move in a way towards distraction, then there's a possibility of just cutting it off, like experientially, or just going up and coming immediately back, like that's one option, right? Then, he gives other analogies, right, where if your concentration is strong enough on what you're focusing on, then he gives an analogy that's from, I think, Sarha or something, where he says it's like a bird that's arises from a ship out in the middle of the ocean that has no choice but to come back to the ship, right, because it's so far out. So there's a sense of like, if you can't cut it off, that you can stay with your object and know, oh, the mind's going away, but my concentration will stay on the object. I won't lose the object, and that will it'll come back and settle. So that's a different one, and he gives different, so there are some that like where you cut off the distraction immediately. There are others where you notice it, but you kind of settles back. There are some where you just kind of strengthen your concentration more, and on the object at that moment, and that can work, but then like what they say is if those don't work, because if your concentration is strong enough and those work, then that's best, right? Because it takes less away. But then experientially, for me anyway, if there are times where like, if in this example, if it's connected to a mental affliction, then sometimes one has to stop actually, and actually they say that there are times where it's better to stop the concentration meditation and actually focus on the antidote, so like to say, okay, if I'm angry, for example, and I'm trying to meditate and it keeps going to anger and going to anger, then it's better to stop the meditation session and work on, okay, why, like, how do I, what are the antidotes to anger? Let me apply those, or try, like whatever it might be you're caught up in, but to actively use the antidotes taught to that specific mental affliction. And then once the mental affliction is calmed down, then go back to one's concentration meditation. So I think there are, and there are other, I'm not remembering them all. There are others like that in Panchen Rinpoche's text. There are other like ways of working. He teaches like a whole list of different ways of working with distractions, really. Like, but those are a few examples. I don't know if does that get it? Is there more to that one?
No, that's really helpful. And I should have remembered there's that whole list of things to do when you're distracted. Like, absolutely. Thank you. It was nice to be reminded of the bird returning to the ship and all of that. It's great.
Yeah.
Thanks. And I think my second question is around, so there seems to be like in the realm of distractibility from beneficial thing to beneficial thing, right? Like, I mean, I think that as you were talking, I think I solved it in that it's about having wisdom about the triage. Like if you're trying to do one beneficial thing and then you're getting pulled to 50,000 other beneficial things. When I think about emergency room docs and, you have to be able to triage. It's just a matter of wisdom. And I think that the thing I really struggle with is ultimately, if we know that in samsara, we're just, even in some of our acts of kindness, there's sort of like a rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic kind of nature to things. Like, when do we decide that the most important thing is actually deepening our dharma practice, when there's like, it's this perennial question of like, if there's suffering beings who have in this realm material needs that can be met, and when you're in a position in your life, like, you have emergency kind of jobs, how do you ever decide that, developing single point of concentration is more important, right? So that is, it's a real struggle for me about how to, and I'm just playing with this like notion that I don't think I always know what I don't have wisdom about the triage when people bring 12 different incredibly horrific, urgent things to me on the same day. Which thing do I put first is something I think I need more wisdom about. And then like, which means that really I should be focusing on practice more. So I don't know. I don't think my question is very clear. I'm just really struggling with this these days. So any insights on that mess that I just shared would be helpful.
I just for what it's worth, I mean, I don't have an answer to that one, of course, but actually made me think, like, there is a kind of, one point is there is a kind of wisdom that's needed. I agree with you, and actually, I'll just share. It was making me think of a couple of examples. I was like, wow, it's like I remember I can think of actually two different examples, both of which are opposite. Like, one is I was thinking of actually Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche, who there were a number of years where he kept saying to me, he would say, like, oh, I want to go and retreat. I need to do these. He had certain like retreats he wanted to do. They were commitments, I think, from many years earlier, where he'd taken teachings, and his guru, would say, if you take this teaching, the commitment is to do this retreat. And then, like, Rinpoche would say, I'm going to go off and do retreat. So I'm not going to commit next year to teaching. I'm going to maybe in retreat. And then, like, something would come up, where he would then teach, and then he wasn't retreat, didn't, like, kept getting delayed. And I was like, wow, why? Like, I was like, oh wow, why did he? He kept saying he would want to do retreat, but it was like this. He was in that, and then at least one time it was like, I think the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, had said to him, "Oh, they need you to teach. You should teach," or something. So maybe that was why. But and then the opposite happened. I remember one time I was really struck by this. One time, like, it's not my teacher. My friend, one of my very closest friends, is a student of a Kagyu Lama named Mingyur Rinpoche. And there was a point when I remember, like, Mingyur Rinpoche had written a best-selling book and was very popular, was sort of like becoming more and more popular. My friend had been his student from before that and was very excited. It was like his organization and everything were flourishing. And then, like, suddenly Mingyur Rinpoche said, oh, I'll see you guys in a few years. I'm going off for a wandering retreat. Nobody will be able to find me, and he just went to India or Nepal, like both, I think, and he just wandered off, right? And nobody knew where he was for years. And actually, my friend went to him and he said, "Don't worry, I'll see you again." Like, so my friend knew they would meet again, kind of thing. But he just left, and now he's back and quite again, picked up right where he left off, and he's very popular again. And he somehow knew that was most beneficial for him, right? Like, to go off and do his, he was in caves and whatever, I don't know where, in the forest and all kinds of places, I heard. And, like, you go, wow, why was, like, they each made the opposite decision in a certain moment, and you go, why? Like, I don't know. And I guess the only observation I would make is, like, I don't know which is right or wrong. Like, there are some people who, like, will ask, like, their lama for advice about that. And there are other people who just go off and do a retreat, or don't, who just make a decision. I don't know which is right or wrong. Like, I'm not sure. Like, so it's interesting, isn't it? Like,
That's really helpful, Lauren. Thank you. Very, very helpful.
Yeah, it's quite mysterious. I mean, even for high lamas, it's mysterious. So for me, it's mysterious. It's very mysterious. And actually, I'll just share. I realized also for myself, like, I've tended to ask my teachers that question, but then I recently made it clarity to myself that at a certain, I was like, okay, I'm not like I made a commitment now to continue at my office for a certain length of time. But I was like, after that, I'm not asking anymore because I don't want to, like, because they might say no to retreat, and so I'm not going to ask the question because that was a clarity for myself. Is just not about just retreat, but about anything. Is like I've often asked either Lama Zopa Rinpoche or used to be Lama Zopa Rinpoche, used to be Rebbe Rinpoche, or now also Khyentse Rinpoche. But I also was like, but don't ask a question you don't want the answer to. As part of my clarity is like, so, because if you already know what's true, if I already know that I have to do something for my own conscience or my own clarity, then it's better not to ask, because it becomes a problem. But so I don't know. I mean, those are just reflections, but I don't, for any, it's kind of mysterious, isn't it?
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you, Lauren.
Lynn had her hand up.
It seems like it's the clarity that comes from practice as to what you do or how much you do in a certain realm. I mean, it's it always seems that things are overwhelming until I can personally practice and get that clarity, because there's always too much to do. That needs to be done. I mean, that, at least that's my sense of life. And so the only way I can prioritize sounds stupid, but get clarity on what it is I should be doing, or what's the best thing to do, is get that clarity from practice, because that sort of leads you to whatever is the right path. It's sort of simplistic, but I have a really clear impression that that's what I need to do.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Gee, what I just thought, I like also, it's actually weird when you said about the clarity. I agree with what you said, and that made me just think also though that it made me think back to Sujata's question. I was like thinking also that I don't know if this is true actually. So just my own personal thought, but I was like, there have been times in my life for myself, I guess, where I've like been engaged in certain activities and wishing I could do more longer retreats or something. And then I realized I just had this recognition for myself that I was like, oh, I'm so glad I have that. I was like, I became happy to have that tension. If that makes sense. Like, because I was like, if I didn't have that tension, then I wouldn't care. So I was like, then I became like more glad to live in that tension, or something. There was something good for me in that, I guess, at that time, but I'm not, or at times, but I'm not sure if that's even correct. But it was my experience. Yes.
It was sort of clarifying for you.
Yeah.
That tension existed in finding your way to wherever you ended up.
Yeah. Actually, that's weird. It just made me think of like, I didn't get it until just now, but I was like, I was saying like Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche has been teaching continuously, like, oh my gosh, teaching so much. Occasionally does retreats, of course, but maybe that's the message actually. I was thinking also, because I mean, for years Rinpoche has been saying, I'd like to go off and do a retreat. And then gee, that's weird. I can think actually it's kind of funny. Because Gyume Khyentse has been saying that for years to me. And then a few years ago, before the pandemic, I visited his most senior student, Nawang Jordan Rinpoche, who's a former abbot of Gyuto and of Sarah May. And I went to see Rinpoche because he was giving a teaching, but I had to leave to go see Khyentse Rinpoche. Actually, I was coming to California, so I couldn't attend Nawang Jordan Rinpoche's teaching. I went to visit him before I left, and I said, "How have you been doing?" And he started. It was funny. He's like, right. He did a 3-year retreat. He's done humongous number of retreats. He's been abbot of 3 major Gelugpa monasteries. And I said, I kind of went to see him for just hang out a little bit. And then he said, I really want to do this. He started listening to me. He said, I want to do a longer retreat of this deity, and then of this deity, and then of this deity, and then of that. And he was like, telling me all these retreats he wanted to do. And he said, but I've been abbot. I couldn't do that. And he said, now I'm not abbot. And I knew that he would soon be like next in line to be appointed to the position of Sherpa Choje, which is next in line to be Gamden Tripa. And so he was like, I could see that he was going like, well, in between being abbot of Sarah May, but before I get appointed to that, I better do them now, or like it's never going to happen, because once you're Sherpa Choje, then you become Gamden Tripa, and then you're having to be the head of the Gelugpa tradition. And so I was like, that was my impression. He was telling me all these retreats, and then COVID came, and I was like, oh, I hope he's getting to do. COVID hit, and I was like, oh, I hope he's getting to do them now. He doesn't have to travel or so. So I was like, oh, he was living in that same, in a very different level. He did a 3-year Crystal Bar retreat or something. It says, like, actually, it's funny. It says online he did 3-year retreat of Shakespeare. I said, you did that? And then he said, how do you know I did that? I said, it says it on the internet. He was like, he wouldn't confirm it, but I said, it says in your biography on the internet. And he was like, oh, who put that on the internet? But and even Rinpoche actually, he did many, many years of retreat. But I remember when he was dying of cancer, he said to me, like, he wanted to come back and be who he is, and young boy at the monastery, but he kept saying, like, I want to go back to India and do some retreat after all this cancer treatment. Like, so it's kind of interesting if I think of like anyway, you know, I'm just sort of going on, but I think they were sort of sharing a similar tension or something, or not in their case. I don't think it was a tension, but it's a similar aspiration. Shudansa, sorry, go ahead.
I think I've realized there's a point at which so you can get to this point where a lot of people are asking you for things that you have the capacity to do. I've been thinking about, like, you talk about Yume Kensei Rinpoche. I don't like, he has everything that others need to, like, how does he ever decide to not be outward facing when his current level of gifts and like whatever he has is more than enough for all of us out here, right? And he could literally be doing it 24/7, and all of us could still need more and more and more of what he has. So, like, how does he ever decide, given where he's arrived, you know? But then there's only one of him. I mean, what do I know? I mean, maybe he's able to manifest in multiple realms at the same time, but currently there's only one of him, right? And so, you know, until he's got the 1,000 arms and the 13 heads or whatever he's going to be capable of, you know, sooner than me, right? Then, like, how to decide, you know, when to go get those extra arms, right? To do what is required to get the extra arms and heads. But for me, what I realized as this conversation was going on is that it's much more basic. It is, I have reached the point where I'm blessed that there are countless people coming to me with horrific issues that I do have some level of skill to assist in. And there's a certain point at which my mental capacity to be of benefit actually hits the ceiling, or that there are just too many things for the amount of time I have in a day. And so at a certain point, I do need to go, like, on retreat. I need to go, you know, I just can't seem to imagine what that might look like in my material life, but that's just about karma and, you know. So this was really, really clarifying. And I hope I didn't take us down too big of a rabbit hole from distraction, and distracted but
Distracted from distraction.
yeah, distracted from distraction. But this is really illuminating, and yeah, thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you too. Wilhelmina, that's her.
Yeah, as you know, I've been going from what I was going to do, what practice I was going to do, and that I changed my expectations and brought it. And now I've come in a different stage again, that I really feel that Chittamalitara is really calling me now. And it has led me there. It has taken me there. It has, when I got the manual, and I started a couple of years ago, and I started to open it, I just have got a shock going through me. And so I'm just trying to put logic together. And now I'm still not sure whether I can do it, but I'm trying to prepare myself. And now this has come with Lama Zopa, and again, it's Chittamalitara, and so Chittamalitara. And I think that's what it is right now. So I'm happy that I've got some clarity, and I know the struggle, because can I do this? Am I capable of doing this? There's so many things in my life with health and other stuff that I have to be attentive to. But I can't wait any longer, you know? So it just has to be done. So that's why I think the car was taken away from me, and I get the groceries at home now, so that I get the time available more, and inspiration. An inspiration with the passing of Lama Zopa, and all that is just coming together now. So I'm still hoping that's what it is, but that's what it feels like. So yeah, it's a struggle. It's just being open to whatever is realistic as well. Yeah. So I just wanted to share that.
That's good. But it sounds like you had your own clarity about Chitta Manitara. That's similar to Lynn's point about sometimes you develop in meditation your own clarity about what's
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
right
yeah,
at that time for you, and that you
yeah,
have some clarity.
yeah.
About that.
Yeah, that was helpful. Yeah, that was very helpful.
That's great.
Yeah.
And I
To
think
hear the different.
my opinion is you're capable.
Yeah, it gives me some peace. Gives me some peace. Yeah, and I get enthusiastic about it. So
This is a
yeah,
good sign, right? Enthusiasm,
yeah,
good sign. It's like joyous
yeah.
effort.
That's what Lamazop always said to me.
Huh.
That was nice to hear.
Was what?
That he said you have fun doing it, or you
Oh,
enjoy
yeah.
doing it when he wrote me the last time. So I keep that in mind. That is for me necessary to stay in the game, so to speak.
Enjoy.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
These classes have been so helpful.
To me too.
Yeah.
Any others? Oh, yeah, I'll say, okay, so actually I'll say the next, this time, the next set is an interesting category. So it's interesting to kind of look at a little bit, is the 4 changeable mental factors. And so I just have to say, so what does changeable mean? I just thought this is interesting. These are 4 that can either be virtuous or non-virtuous or neutral, depending on your motivation and how you engage in them. So you can make them virtuous or you can make them non-virtuous, right? Because the others are like there are the virtuous states of mind that are by nature virtue, right? Then there are the non-virtues, the secondary, for primary and secondary mental afflictions are by nature non-virtuous. But these 4 are changeable in the sense that, how you approach them and with what motivation can make them virtue or non-virtue. And the first of them is sleep, right? Actually, let's explore it. So it says, what is sleep? Question. It is a withdrawal of the mind in dependence upon sleep, its cause, with respect to virtue, non-virtue, and unspecified, timely and untimely, appropriate and inappropriate. Actually, I want to read a different. Geshe Rabton says, sleep is a mental factor that makes the mind unclear, gathers the sense consciousnesses inward, and renders the mind incapable of apprehending the body. So that's I think that's I don't know. I mean, I like that description. And in Vasubandhu, as translated by Art, it says, what is sleep? The uncontrolled contraction of the mind's activity. Activity means engaging of an object by the mind. Sleep is a state that gives rise to the mind's loss of control over the activity. Alternatively, the mind's inability to maintain its hold on the body is the mind's loss of control over activity. And sleep is a state that gives rise to that condition. So in brief, right, what is sleep? Sleep is where the mind contracts inward, right? No longer engages with the objects of the senses, right? And no longer has control over the body's activities. That's how they're defining sleep, which is interesting because usually you don't define. Usually sleep isn't really defined. I thought that was intriguing in and of itself. But I think what's really interesting here, worth reflecting on, is it's an interesting point, right? We spend I guess we're all a little different, but you spend a fairly high percentage. We all spend a fairly high percentage of our lives of necessity asleep, right? If we don't, unless you're like Lama Zopa actually was, then he didn't have to sleep. But ordinary people have to sleep. If you have calm abiding, I guess there are special insight, then it's different. But for ordinary people, you have to sleep, or it's not good for your health. Anyway, Rinpoche was he actually didn't have to sleep. I remember sometimes one time he was at my house and he had not slept for, I think, 3 days. And he asked me to help him dictate something, and he fell asleep for about, I think, less than a minute. And then he woke up. That was his sleep for after 3 days. Was like, maybe 2 minutes, 1 or 2 minutes. And then he said, "Oh, I was just dreaming. I was in Dharamsala walking around the Dalai Lama's temple." So it's like he got like, I don't know, it was somewhere between a minute and 3 minutes of sleep in 3 days. And in that 3 minutes, he was circumambulating the Dalai Lama's temple in Dharamsala. And then he was like, now back to work. And then he stayed up all night. That night, like, I finally went to sleep, but he stayed up all night. So he didn't have to sleep. That's my point. And many people have observed that, but I've observed it. I mean, people have told me that who are his attendant, but I've observed it myself when he stayed there in the past. So he didn't have to sleep, but the rest of it, ordinary people have to sleep for our health. So the idea here is that sleep can be virtuous, non-virtuous, or neutral. And why is that important? I think it's actually quite important. So I just want to pause here and reflect. We're not at that level where most of us, where we don't have to sleep. It wouldn't, we would just become sick, right? So the idea is to transform your sleep into virtue then, right? And that's why that's why this is emphasized, right? Is if you can transform your sleep into virtue, then what is it like? If you sleep, if you sleep whatever, what is it, a third or a quarter, maybe a quarter of your life or something like that. That's a lot of time. And so, from a practice perspective, if you could make your sleep virtue, then that's a good thing. And so I thought actually to just sort of focus on that just for a moment, because just to say that I don't know if people have studied, I don't know how much you study these, but there are many different methods in Buddhism for transforming your sleep into virtue. And I think it's quite beautiful, really. Like I would call them different levels of practice. So the I guess I would say like what's described in this text, or our text that we're studying, is kind of the minimum level, right? So the minimum level of practice. So he says here, he says, the cause of sleep is feeling heavy of body, weak, fatigued, and a mental engagement to signs of darkness, right? Because your mind initially, right, when you're falling asleep, your mind kind of goes into darkness, because it's absorbing inward. And then he quotes Nagarjuna saying, sleep sleep only for the middle part of the night, not don't sleep too much, is what he's saying, because life is short and use your life well. So sleep, but sleep in the middle of the night. So actually, our author then says Nagarjuna is saying sleep in the middle of the night. So he's saying, so even Nagarjuna is saying sleep. It's not that sleep is non-virtuous then. And so then it becomes an interesting question, like, and so what they're saying is the minimum way to practice virtuous sleep is, first of all, to do virtue during the day. And then when you go to sleep, when you're finally, tired and it's time to go to sleep, to give rise to one of the virtues, right? So as you lay down at night, you can think, well, I'm going to sleep, take care of, an example would be, right? If you're practicing, if you're Mahayana, right? If your practice is in line with bodhicitta, then you might, as you lay down in bed to go to sleep, and as you're starting to fall asleep, you might think, okay, now it's time to rest. I'm doing that for my well-being and health, but not out of a grasp, because one point is not out of attachment to sleep, right? Because if you fall asleep with attachment to sleep, that's a form of attachment, right? The pleasure of sort of, it's actually, I want to differentiate, right? An example of a non-virtuous sleep, right, is like where you just feel like, actually, it's a kind of, I sometimes think this actually, that it's they call it attachment to sleep, right? But that's actually a kind of nihilistic state. Actually, it's a kind of state, sometimes people have that, where it's like, we feel like, we feel life is hard and the world is bad and we want to escape, right? And we feel like sleep is an escape. So we grasp at sleep and we want to like have a long sleep to get out of everything, right? That's not very Mahayana, is it? It's like I'd like to escape into a kind of what's the word? Unawareness. because what's the word? So it's almost, yeah, it has a kind of, I mean, it's not nihilism, but it has a kind of nihilistic quality of like, I don't like the world, so let me just go escape into a kind of a nothing state or something. That's not virtuous, right? That would be an example of non-virtuous sleep. But an example of virtuous sleep would be if one laid down in bed and thought, well, I've done my best today. You know, maybe you purify. Like, so actually Lama Zopa used to teach that a lot. Like, you would say, you think back over your day, right? And you think, okay, if I did any non-virtue, let me purify it, right? So you do Vajrasattva or something, or some kind of purification. If I did any virtue, which I hopefully did, let me rejoice in that, right? So you rejoice. And then you think, now is the time to rest and restore my body and my well-being. You know, and so the purpose of my sleep is to take care of myself in order to take care of others, right? In order to then wake up tomorrow and be loving and practice Dharma and help other, you know, and progress on the path to enlightenment and be of benefit to the world. How wonderful, I get to sleep for that purpose. Right? And then I'm going to sleep with bodhicitta, right? And then you can fall asleep like that. That's virtuous sleep, right? And that's very different from world sucks, let me just escape into nothing. You know, like those are two, they're just mental states, but one, what they make a point is that in the one, that entire then say, I don't know, hours of sleep are non-virtue, right? The other, if you do the bodhicitta version, then all that time of sleep are virtue. So it's different, you know. And then in Buddhism, there are many other sleep yogas, they call them. Like actually in Vajrayana, in Tantric Buddhism, there are many sleep yogas from, like, there are some where it's like you know, actually, well, I won't go to deity yoga ones because not everybody practices that, but there's one where you imagine, like, actually there's one beautiful one where you think of your guru, you think you're laying your head down, like on your guru's lap, and your guru like rubs your head and encourage, you know, and says like, you know, like, I'll keep you safe, and you'll dream of deities or whatever, and of Dharma, you know, and when you wake up in the morning, you think your guru is waking you up or something, and the dakinis are singing songs and waking you up, something like that. Like, you know, that's a very simple sleep yoga, right? Like, it's because your mind then actually, because going back to the, why is that a virtue? Is actually because what was the first of the virtuous minds? Faith, right? Then your mind is going to sleep with a sense of faith, right? And if your mind goes to sleep with faith, then it's virtuous mind, right? You know, if you go to sleep with a sense of love for all beings, that would be virtuous sleep, right? And then in the completion, actually, I just finished editing the first draft of a text by Yume Kensho Rinpoche on the 6 yogas of Naropa. In that text, he goes into very advanced yogas where you're like practicing lucid dreaming. You know, actually, the first is lucid dreaming, where you can actually be aware in your dreams, right? And he teaches methods for that. Then there's even the harder one, actually, is lucid deep sleep. Very advanced tantric yogis can be even aware during their deep sleep phase, where they meditate on emptiness in the state of deep sleep, which actually prepares you. A slight tangent here, but actually, they say if you can meditate, if you can integrate your deep sleep with an awareness of emptiness, then it prepares you to do what Lama Zopa Rinpoche just did, which is to actually meditate when you die, you know, and meditate in the state of death itself. But actually, they say if you can't meditate in deep sleep, then you won't be very good at meditating in the state of death, because death is more subtle than deep sleep. You know, so that's actually, they actually say the tantric yogis test themselves. You know, can I meditate in my dreams? And then if you can meditate in your state of deep sleep, then you know you're ready to meditate. You're well prepared to meditate at the moment of death. Or if you can't meditate in deep sleep, then, you know, you can still die virtuously with a good virtuous state of mind. But the advanced yogis like Lama Zopa Rinpoche, it's that the person who can meditate in deep sleep then can meditate in the moment of death more effectively, you know, so to speak. So, you know, and if you were doing that, then of course sleep is very virtuous. Imagine that if every night, actually, you were like, even in your state of deep sleep. And actually, by the way, that's, you know, there's a famous story, Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, right? The famous story of that is that Shantideva was a monk at Nalanda, right? Nalanda Monastic University. And all the other monks like were making fun of him and didn't like him because they thought he slept too much. You know, they practiced what this text it mentions by Nagarjuna, right? Sleep in the middle, only the middle section of the night. And he'd be like sleeping in, like the sun would already be up. Maybe it was like, you know, he was like the sun would be up and people would be at their chanting and at their breakfast and then at their class, and he was still asleep. And so they thought, what's wrong with him? He's like not a good monk and he's bad. And they tried to kick him out of the monastery. So they said, oh, you give a discourse, and then they made the throne too high so he couldn't get up on it. And they tried to get him expelled from the monastery by challenging him to give a discourse, thinking he didn't know anything. And then he gave the discourse, the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, which is, as Dalai Lama says, is the greatest text ever composed about bodhicitta practice, right? So anyway, so he was a practitioner of dream yoga. My point in all that is Shantideva was a practitioner of dream yoga, right? So why was he sleeping so much? It wasn't that he was lazy, actually. He was in these deep states of meditation. So he would practice dream yoga. He was aware of his dreams. He would practice the yoga of deep sleep, so he was actually doing advanced practices, that in those subtle states of awareness. So in that sense, sleep can become, so at our level, depending on our level, we can try to we don't just try, we can do it. Actually, it's not that hard. We can make our sleep virtuous, right? And so I want to say, like, if you can do those, if you're capable of those advanced yogas, then do them. That's very good. If you can do, for example, lucid dreaming, people do that. Some people are capable to do that, even if you're not like an advanced tantric yogi. Some people have a natural capacity, right? But what they say is if you're practicing Dharma, then use your awareness in the dream to do practices. You can try to visit a Pure Land or do other practices or meditate on emptiness in your dream. Your mind is more subtle, so use it to meditate on emptiness, for example, and so on. If you have that ability to lucid dream. But even if you don't, which I don't, I'm not good at that, then at least, go to sleep by cultivating virtue. That makes sense? Yeah, so cultivate loving kindness or compassion or bodhicitta. I give the example, right? To think, okay, I'm resting to benefit all sentient beings. Or you can imagine sending out love to all beings and fall asleep like that or whatever. There are many, there are infinite practices you can do, but any of those is good. So I think that's the key point here. I mean, he goes into details about afflicted sleep causes very basically, the idea here, the core idea that he's getting at, I just think we'll say that is, you're going to sleep either way, right? Your sleep, we need to, we don't have a choice. We're going to sleep. So what he's saying really in essence, I think, is you're going to sleep and that's good. You need to sleep for your health, but try not to go to sleep with a sense of grasping at sleep. That's not helpful, right? Go to sleep instead with a sense of, actually just with this awareness, right? I'm caring for my body in order to be healthy so that I can practice the path and benefit the world. That's simple enough, right? That's the simplest version. If you go to sleep with that kind of mind, then there's some virtue, and then you can also think, if I'm going to dream tonight, may I dream of, may I dream of Tara or Avalokiteshvara or the Dalai Lama or Amazopa, or whatever, may I dream of my teachers or deities or Buddha, and even if you don't dream of them, that aspiration, eventually you will. That's, because actually it's true, isn't it? Also, what we think about, actually that's true also, because our dreams come from our imprints, right? For the most part. Sometimes the dreams come from other things, but mostly they come from our imprints. So, if you go to sleep with that kind of aspiration or something, then also eventually it will happen. So that's also good, because it's creating an imprint for that. So anyway, there are many different things you can do, but the idea is to sleep with a sense of virtue. And again, because that's the point here. These are all changeable, right? They can be virtuous or non-virtuous. So our task is to make them virtuous. So you do whatever level of sleep yoga you want, and actually we said we might. It's not. I don't think, at some point, if we'll study Vajrayana, then there are many different other practices we'll study. Actually, if we study like tantric stages and paths or tantric commentary, there are many beautiful details of sleep yogas from the Vajrayana practice that are really quite remarkable, beautiful practices. So those are taught there, that are for using the dream and a dream state and deep sleep state. There are different states of sleep, right? There's falling asleep, there's deep sleep, there's dreams. And those are actually, if you have a Fitbit, you can see that, right? I mean, there's deep sleep and REM sleep. I mean, you can see that, it shows up on your app or whatever. If somebody does a brain scan, they can actually watch your brain doing that. So those are things that happen. But we can integrate all those into Dharma practice to varying degrees. And then let's do one more, regret. Because I think this one's also quite interesting. That regret, it says here, is a remorseful mind, right? Dependent upon any proper activity or improper activity, intended or unintended, with respect to. So anyway, again, I just want to emphasize how to practice this. I just think this is, I think this is fascinating teaching. So, well, actually, let's see. It says here also, Art Engel's text says, regret is the mind's sense of remorse. And Fisher Evans says, regret is a mental factor that, having regarded something one did in the past as bad, causes the mind to become displeased and distraught. It has the function of not allowing the mind to rest at ease and of acting as a basis for bringing about mental unhappiness. Right? So any of those are definitions or descriptions, right? A sense of remorse. And here's the key point, actually, that's worth noting and thinking about is if you regret a non-virtuous action, that's virtue. Right. And actually, if you've done purification practice, you have to cultivate regret, right? They sometimes call it intelligent regret. Right. So if you did some kind of negative karmic action, part of Dharma practice actually is to develop a sense of regret, right? And so how do you do that? You have to think, well, that's bad, actually. It hurts, it's like, why do I regret it? You have to actually contemplate, well, it's going to cause harm, right? Like, so if you did something that, say, harmed somebody, right, then you have to contemplate, well, wait a second. Their ascension being wants to be happy. I actually caused them suffering. The karmic result of that will be myself suffering. Then it will be an obstacle to me doing other things that I want, like accomplishing virtuous or positive things in the future because I created a karmic obstacle to myself. And you think about like the harm you cause to others, the harm you cause to yourself, the obstacles you've created to further benefit of others, until you develop a sense of genuine regret, actually, for a negative action, right? And that's that's part of the process of purifying. It's the most important step in purifying your negative karma, right? Whether any of the practices of purification involve generating this inner mental factor, right, of regret for an improper action, right? So to regret an improper action, you have to really understand the faults of it, don't you? Why it's faulty. And what they're pointing out here is regret is not inherently virtuous, though, because sometimes we regret the virtuous things we did, right? And that's non-virtuous regret, right? So, and there are many examples of that, aren't there? Like where, like for example, a typical example is somebody in a moment of genuine generosity gives something away, right? With genuine generosity in their heart, but then afterwards they think, oh, I didn't want to give that. Either like you might think, oh, that person didn't deserve it, or I really want that thing now. Why did I give it away? Right. So that would be a non-virtuous regret because you did something beautiful and wonderful in that moment, right? You had generosity in your heart and you did something out of love, loving generosity, and then you regret it, right? And that would be a non-virtuous state of mind that is harm. And just as the part of the point here is, when you did a negative action, if you regret it, that's part of purifying it, right? So it won't ripen, or it won't ripen as strongly. But if you do a virtuous action and you regret it, you decrease its power also. You can destroy that virtuous seed or you can weaken it, right? So part of the idea is like, that's really important from a practical perspective is we have to be intelligent and wise then in the sense of, do virtuous things, but don't do them to like know yourself well enough so that you won't do something you'll regret. Does that make sense? Like, so, and they actually say that, for example, like they'll say like great bodhisattvas give away parts of their body to others, right? And they say, but if you're not at that level, don't try that, because if you're going to regret it, then don't do it. Do it when you, in other words, the bodhisattvas who do that are overjoyed that they got to do it afterwards, right? And part of the idea here is that you should do virtuous actions that you can feel happy about. As Wilhelmina said, that you just would rejoice in, Lamash's advice to you, right? That you can enjoy. that you can have fun doing, that you feel good about, because then you'll do more virtue, right? That's the idea. So don't do like, and actually it's funny. I just remembered a quote. What I was thinking about when I was many years ago, I went to Nepal for a Kopan course with Lama Zopa. So I was remembering that. And I was remembering my sister was in Nepal at the time too, and she went to see, what was his name? A great Nyingma master of Dzogchen. I remember his name right now. Anyway, she went to see this great Nyingma yogi, who's like a very famous master of Dzogchen. And she said to him, I'm thinking of going in retreat. Like, I think I should go do a retreat. Actually, this question, I mean, in a funny way though, but she went to him, and she and her friend, I guess she was a college student. She was like doing a year abroad study kind of like program. The University of Wisconsin had the study abroad program. So she went to this great Dzogchen master, and she said, I'm thinking I should go and do a retreat in the mountains. And he said to the two of them, said that. And he said to the two of them, he said, if you go and do a retreat, you'll feel like you're in prison, and then you'll have regret. Basically, he said, so don't, he said, like, because they were thinking of like doing like a longer retreat. And he said, go for a short time and you'll be happy and you'll be glad you went. He said, don't do a long retreat, because you'll just feel like you're in prison, and then you'll think, why am I here? There's a waste of time, and then you'll regret it. And then that'll be a non-virtue, actually. So he said, do a short retreat and you'll think, oh, that was a great experience. He said, do that. That's better. And so they went, and I have pictures. I still have a picture of her where she's smiling very broadly. She went up to the beautiful place in the Himalayas, and she did like a long weekend or a week. I don't know which. I think it was a long weekend. A retreat, and met a nun and had a really fun time. So she followed his advice, and it was great because she felt good about it. Does that make sense? But he knew her. He could see that they were young people, right? And that if they went for a month or something, or 6 weeks, that they would be like, oh, like, the food isn't good and it's not comfortable, and why am I here? And they didn't know enough. They hadn't learned enough to know how to make good use of retreat yet. So they would just be like, what am I doing here? Right? And then they would have had regret, and then it would have not been a good karma even, right? That's what he was pointing out. I'm just giving an example of this, right? So what the point is like, do virtuous actions that you can feel good about, as Wilhelmina put it, that you can enjoy, and then you'll do more virtuous actions, right? And then eventually you can do bigger, huge ones and not regret them. But don't do ones you'll regret, is the teaching here, because regret is a non-virtue, right? So anyway, the point here with regret is this, is one, okay, still time. So here's the point, a few points I want to make with regret. If we've done something non-virtuous, we have to try to cultivate regret for it, right? And that's easier with big non-virtues, right? If you did something that you really think is like terrible, then it's easy to generate regret. But that's hard with our small non-virtues, actually. Sometimes I've noticed. There are some non-virtues that you think, well, it's no big deal, and I kind of like that. It's just a little one, it's no big deal or something. But we have to develop regret, or we won't purify it, we won't change. So we have to actually try to develop regret by understanding, if it's non-virtuous, is it really non-virtuous? And what makes it non-virtuous? You know what I mean? Like, and because otherwise it's like that, somebody else says it's non-virtuous, so I'm not supposed to do it, but I want to do it. It's like that. Like a teenager whose parents says don't go out, and then you want to go out. So you say, well, I'm going out anyway, or something. We're like that, is my point. Like with some, because we don't understand, is it actually a cause of suffering? Does that make sense? We don't understand, we have to actually understand, is this a cause of suffering or not? And if we understand how it causes suffering, then we'll regret it, because we don't want to suffer. But the problem is that we don't know, right? Shantideva says that. He says, although we don't want suffering, we run towards the causes of suffering. Although we want happiness, we destroy our causes of happiness, right? Shantideva points out, because we don't know what to regret and what not to regret. Is what Shantideva said. So we actually have to, kind of funny, we have to learn what to regret, actually, right? And then with regards to virtues, like that Lama, that great Lama said to those two young women, don't do something that you think is virtuous that you'll regret, because you won't do something smaller, right? That was his advice, was very wise, right? Do something smaller that you'll enjoy, and then build up, gradually or something. And one other point, though, I just was thinking about when I was thinking about regret, is also, so often also we have like what's called, here he said, because our author says there's unspecified regret, right? There's virtuous, non-virtue, and unspecified. And so many times people do the unspecified regret. There's where people regret things that, who cares? Like, so they say, oh, I regret that I bought that shirt. Right? Like, that's not worth regretting. It's not of any significance, actually, right? So there are a lot of regret, or I regret that I said something, you know, not something, if we regret you said something because you hurt somebody, that's virtue, right? But there's so many times where you're like, what's the word? I regret that I said that because I might have looked stupid. Like, who cares if I look stupid? You know what I mean? Like, as far as, like, that's not of any significance, actually. You know, so oftentimes we regret things that are unimportant, actually, right? Like, that don't matter. And that would be unspecified regret. So it's like, I think this is kind of funny in a way. It's like, save your regrets for what's worthy of regret. If that makes sense, right? Like, actually, I'll say, because I've also noticed that as a therapist, like, people spend so much time regretting things that are neutral, actually, that like are not that aren't wrong, you know. And it's like, if you're going to regret something, regret that you harmed somebody or harmed yourself. Don't regret, like, I don't know, that you didn't look good or something, or you didn't say something that looked cool, or you didn't regret something that sort of people thought was impressive, like whatever. I don't, you know, those are the wrong regrets. Anyway, that's just like Sujata has her hand up.
Lauren, can you help with the what is the mental affliction that arises after? Okay, so you develop the regret for your past misdeed, and that's virtuous. But then, you know, in my personal experience, I often then spiral into something more narcissistic and self-hatred-y. And so what is that point where, like, I'm pretty good at, definitely with the big things, I'm pretty good at, like, oh, that one was obvious. And I'm even starting to get good at some of the more subtle, like, oh, that was my ego. Thought I was helping somebody, and then it was really about this other thing. And, you know, and I can catch it and I can see it, but then I go to a dark place. And so what is the mental affliction that is kicking in there, where I go from regretting a non-virtue, yay, to some sort of negative narcissistic thing that actually doesn't help me get back into a good place?
My own tell me, I mean, my own experience around that, I guess I'll say, and then tell me if this gets it, is I think it's you know, so I mean, you start with what you said, or start with what you said, saying. So, like, there's a certain early point where one develops just simple regret, right? So, like, oh wow, this is a cause of suffering. I really, you know, there's a genuine regret, like you were describing. And sometimes, even with regret, as it says in the text, that can even be quite visceral. Like, sometimes it's like if it's a small thing, it can be just like, oh wow, I really regret that. Let me do purification. If it's a bigger thing, or if you really feel it, it can be a more visceral experience of like, oh my goodness, you know, really like kind of a deeper feeling of regret. But that's still regret, right, up to that point. And I think there's a key, just in my own experience of myself, at least, there's a key moment that comes sometimes where the view of the transitory collection jumps in. You know, so it starts to be like, it's not just regretting the action, it starts to be I and my, you know, that sense of I did that, how could I do that? You know, that's my this, and you know, so it's the view, I think and once the view of the transitory collection starts to, it's like I can actually sometimes now, if I think about it with myself, but also even with other people, you could feel it sometimes as they're describing that process, like where there's a line between, so I would call it regretting the action, which is very clear, to a sense of like, yes, think of it as I think of it that way, the view of the transitory collection, where now it's not just the action, it's my action, right? And I did this. And then it can give the kind of negative pride, right, that we've talked about, that, you know, I'm the worst of the worst. That's one of the versions of pride, right? So, but as it says in our text here, the view of the pride comes along with the view of the transitory collection, though. So I think actually that's my own experience, is that there's the regret, then the view of the transitory collection kind of takes ownership of that regret. It's my action. I did that, with a sense of it's not just some transitory. With regret, you can see it's just an action, right? It's a transitory phenomena. But then there comes the kind of a reification of the view of transitory collection. And then sometimes that can lead to the negative pride. I'm the worst of the worst. I'm so terrible. How can, and then so it can either be the view of the transitory collection itself, or pride, negative pride in that sense. I think that's what usually it is.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. So then the trick, I think, for me will be, like, in thinking about even applying emptiness at that moment that I'm starting to cross over, but then not doing it too soon as to use it as a spiritual bypass on sitting with the regret. So That's great. Thank you so much.
Good. And yeah, any other questions about that? Or if not, I'll just finish this part about regret. There's one other point he makes here. I just want to, before we stop, he also says, so he makes the point I already said. Regret for past misdeeds is virtue. Regret for having created merit, for having done something good, is non-virtue. Regret for something that is neither benefited nor harmed others, such as manual work, is unspecified, right? So if you regret, like, if you regret that you fixed your fence or something, that's, whatever, that's not specified either. He says the timely and the untimely, the appropriate and the inappropriate, means that generating regret when something is rectifiable is appropriate, whereas regret when it is not is inappropriate. Appropriateness of regret when it is rectifiable refers to, for instance, the necessity to confess misdeeds and regret before the fruition has been established in the present. Not rectifiable refers to, for instance, rebirth in a bad migration, or having been born with a disability, or he gives different examples, so forth. Really what he's getting at there, the key point there, I'll conclude with this and we'll do the dedication. I think the key point here is this, he's talking about regretting misdeeds, right? And what he's getting at, I think the key point is this, is, if you want to do purification practice, that's good. We should do that, right? And we should and part of that, as we were just talking about, is generating regret, intelligent regret. But what he's getting at is that we do purification of a certain negative karma mostly before it's ripened, and it's kind of getting at a similar point. It's not exactly what Sujato is raising, but it's a similar point. Sometimes people will, like, once a bad result comes, it's a slightly different, but there's a kind of quality that's similar to this. Sometimes people will do this when a bad experience is ripened, then the person will say, I'm so terrible, this is all my fault. How could I, like some kind of it would be almost like self-pity or something that can happen. And what he's saying is that's also not helpful, right? Like, in other words, at that point, the thing is already ripened. There's nothing to do about that. It's ripened already. Bear it with courage, practice Dharma in the context of it, use Lojong or whatever, but don't sort of become some kind of self-pity. Don't let yourself get caught in a self-pity mind. It's not the same thing that you were getting, but it's a similar point in the sense of it's a kind of wrong regret. In other words, at that point, at that point, it's not so helpful to focus on that question. At that point, actually in Tibetan practitioners usually will say, oh, good, now it is being purified through the ripening. Now this karma will be finished. That's great. I'm finishing the karma this way. I didn't get around to purifying it through some kind of formal meditation, so it's getting purified by ripening. Now I'll be done with it, and that's that. But not to sort of get out. So what he's getting at is, don't at that point think, oh, this is so terrible and I'm so terrible and so on, and sort of beat yourself up. That's not helpful. That's really the point there. I just wanted to mention that one because it's a different kind of mistake we can make is regret. He's saying regret it at the right time, so meaning the sooner after you've done it, right? In other words, the quicker you can catch yourself and regret something and purify it, the better. But don't get caught up in like some negative self-image thing after, or things have ripened, because we've all created negative karma and it's going to ripen. That's part of being a samsaric being, and that's okay, and move on, like that. So I'll stop there, and I actually yesterday I was going to send out a list of additional classes, but got totally caught up with, of course, things related to the passing of Rinpoche Lama Zopa Rinpoche, so that didn't happen. But I think I'll send that. I think we should do probably one more class to do the last of these changeable mental factors, and then there's a beautiful concluding session that's worth looking at. So I'll send out I'll send it out, and Gabe will post it. We'll get it posted, but I'll send it out in the next few days. But we'll do one class in May, I guess it'll be. In early May probably, and then I'll just mention a couple quick things too. So we'll do one more class in this series in May. If you've done most of these classes but haven't emailed me, I'm making a list now of people to get completion certificates. FPMT likes to give completion certificates to people who've done the classes. It's just a good practice. I think it's kind of cool. And so if you haven't emailed me already, you've done most of these classes, just send me a quick email saying, hey, I've done most of the classes, because I'm going to send a list of the people to FPMT for them to kind of create those completion certificates. So please send me an email about that. That's just logistical. And then I've a couple of things. After that, so I'll send out the thing about this class. After this series of classes ends, I'm going to do a couple of 2 or 3 like one-off classes. Some people ask me questions about Tantra, for example. So I want to do a class on Intro to Tantra, and then maybe one other class. Like, so a couple of classes just related to things people have been asking about. And then we'll do another basic program class after that, which I think will certainly be online. It may also be in person. We may do both. We may do a hybrid, but it's definitely going to include an online component. It may also include in person, depending on it and people's interest. I mean, that which one it'll be is being decided by democracy, a vote. So I sent out a list, and people have sent in their ideas, but it's close between 2. So I guess my point is, if you care about that, if you have an opinion of the base, the ones that it's close between, I'll mention those. So you can. So if you haven't voted, send me an email about that too. And the ones that are kind of up there in number are let's see. I guess there are 3 that are kind of all close. Any of them, if more people vote, could win. One is chapter 1 on the Uttara Tantra, the Sublime Continuum, which is like a text on Buddha nature, mostly the nature of the 3 jewels and what Buddha nature is. A beautiful text, actually. It has all these beautiful poetic metaphors for Buddha nature to get the experience of Buddha nature. So that's one option. Another option that's near the top is Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. And the other one that's close is a commentary on Tantra, but for that one you have to have initiation. And at some point I'll give a little explanation about intro to Tantra, but on that point I just want to say also, if people actually a couple people email me, so I'll email back about Tantra, but Gima Kentrim, she's giving an initiation in Connecticut soon. But there are different levels of Tantra, so and there are commitments come with that. So it's wonderful to practice Tantra preaching, but also you have to be kind of wanting to take on. One is you have to have some familiarity with bodhicitta, emptiness, at least to some level of familiarity with that. And the other is you have to, depending on the level, usually for the 2 levels of Tantra that are usually given in America, one is action Tantra. For that, the level of commitment is the Bodhisattva vow. Take the Bodhisattva vow, right, which is a commitment to the practice of bodhicitta. And usually the lamas will sometimes recite a few mantras of that deity. That's pretty simple. But if you take highest yoga tantra, then you take the Bodhisattva vow. But there are also certain other commitments to practice, like particularly the 6 session guru yoga, which takes like it could take anywhere from 5 minutes a day to an hour a day, depending on what you want to do. But most people do it in 5 or 10 minutes a day, probably, or something. But it's a practice that's part of the commitment. And there are some other commitments I could describe at some point. But anyway, so those are the 3, though. So if you haven't voted and you have an opinion, let me know if you're interested in either the Sublime Continuum on Buddha nature, Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, or a Tantric commentary. And then we'll make a decision. And once that's decided, I'll send out what the topic is and which month we'll start those in. Should do dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. It has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, so that the I, who is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side. In order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, dependently arisen, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. And then also we could dedicate, regarding Kyabje Lama Zopa Rinpoche, just passed away. May his enlightened activities continue. May all of his projects and his projects to benefit the world continue and increase. May all of his aspirations that he made and efforts continue to flourish and benefit sentient beings. And may the his unmistaken reincarnation quickly be found, and have success in continuing the kind of enlightened activities that Rinpoche engaged in. Well, thanks everybody.
Thanks, Lauren. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'll send out an email soon
Thank
about
you.
when the final class in this series. Oh, and remember, do send me an email if you have it about the completion certificates, because I don't want to leave anybody out. Okay, thanks, sir.
Thank you, Lauren.